In 2018, the European Union did something no major agricultural economy had done before. It banned outdoor use of the three most widely used insecticides on Earth across all 27 member states, specifically because of the risk they pose to bees. Those insecticides are still legal and still widely used on millions of acres of American farmland today. This video is about why Europe made that call, what the actual evidence behind it looked like, and why the US has taken a genuinely different and much slower path on the same question, one that has less to do with disagreeing about the science and more to do with how differently the two systems are built to respond to uncertainty. The chemicals in question are called neonicotinoids, neonics for short, and specifically three of them: clothianidin, imidacloprid, and thiamethoxam. They're a class of systemic insecticides, meaning they don't just sit on the surface of a plant. They get absorbed into the plant's entire vascular system, showing up in its leaves, stems, and, crucially, its pollen and nectar. That systemic property is exactly what made them so commercially successful starting in the 1990s. A single seed coating protects the entire plant as it grows, without needing repeated spraying. By the 2010s, neonics had become the most widely used class of insecticide in the world, applied to the vast majority of US corn and a large share of soybean acreage as a standard seed treatment, often without farmers making an active per-field decision to use them at all, since treated seed became close to the industry default. The problem is the same property that makes them effective against crop pests also means any pollinator visiting that plant's flowers is exposed to the insecticide through the nectar and pollen itself, not just through direct contact with a spray. Starting around 2006, beekeepers across the US and Europe began reporting a phenomenon that came to be called colony collapse disorder, otherwise healthy-seeming hives where the worker bees would simply disappear, leaving the queen and immature bees behind with no clear cause of death. It became a major public concern precisely because bees are not just a curiosity. They are responsible for pollinating a huge share of the crops humans actually eat. And a sustained decline in pollinator populations carries direct implications for food production, not just abstract ecological concern. It is worth understanding just how dominant neonics became in such a short window, because the scale is part of what made this such a consequential regulatory decision either way. Within roughly a decade and a half of their introduction, neonicotinoids grew from a niche new chemistry to the single most widely used insecticide class in the world by volume, a speed of market adoption that outpaced the scientific community's ability to fully study their ecological effects before they were already saturating global agriculture. Seed companies increasingly sold neonic-treated seed as the standard product, with untreated seed becoming the harder to find, sometimes special order option in several major crop categories, which meant many farmers were, in effect, defaulting into neonic use through their seed supplier's standard catalog, rather than making an active chemical purchasing decision each season the way older, sprayed pesticides had traditionally required. Colony collapse disorder turned out to have multiple contributing factors: parasitic mites, viral pathogens, habitat loss, and nutritional stress from monoculture farming all played a documented role, and no single cause fully explains it. But a growing body of research through the 2010s specifically implicated neonicotinoid exposure as a significant contributing factor, even in cases well short of outright colony collapse. Sublethal exposure was linked in multiple peer-reviewed studies to impaired bee navigation and homing ability, reduced foraging efficiency, weakened immune response, making colonies more vulnerable to the mites and pathogens that were already a known problem, and measurably reduced queen bee reproductive success. In 2013, based on a formal risk assessment from the European Food Safety Authority, the EU implemented a partial restriction on the three neonics specifically for use on flowering crops attractive to bees. EFSA's assessment concluded there were what it called high acute risks to bees from several common uses. That partial restriction ran for 5 years while additional research accumulated. In 2018, EFSA published an updated, more comprehensive risk assessment reviewing over 1,000 studies, and concluded that the risk to both honeybees and wild bee populations was confirmed across essentially all outdoor agricultural uses of the three neonics, not just the flowering crop uses the original restriction had targeted. Based on that expanded assessment, the EU moved from partial restriction to a near total ban on outdoor use, permitting the chemicals only inside permanent greenhouses where pollinator exposure could be fully controlled. In the United States, the regulatory picture has moved much more slowly, and it is worth being precise about why, because it is not simply that American regulators disagree with the underlying BE toxicity science. In many respects, the Environmental Protection Agency's own risk assessments have reached broadly similar conclusions about the specific hazard these chemicals pose to pollinators. The core difference is structural, not scientific. The European Union's approach operates on what is often called the precautionary principle. When a credible peer-reviewed body of evidence raises a serious health or environmental concern, regulators are empowered to restrict a substance even before every uncertainty is fully resolved, placing the burden on industry to prove safety rather than on regulators to prove harm. United States pesticide regulation under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act operates on a cost-benefit registration review process, where the Environmental Protection Agency has to weigh documented environmental and health risk against the agricultural and economic benefit of continued use, and existing registrations remain in effect through a periodic re-registration review cycle rather than being subject to swift suspension the moment a concerning study is published. Neonics were already deeply embedded in United States agricultural supply chains, seed treatment infrastructure, farmer purchasing habits, and pest management planning all built around them. By the time the bee toxicity evidence became robust enough to act on, an unwinding that took a genuinely different regulatory pathway than banning a food additive or cosmetic ingredient outright. The Environmental Protection Agency did take some action in 2022 following a court order stemming from a lawsuit brought by environmental and beekeeping advocacy groups who argued the agency had failed to adequately consider Endangered Species Act obligations in its neonic registrations. The Environmental Protection Agency proposed additional mitigation measures, things like reduced application rates and expanded no-spray buffer zones near sensitive habitats for several major neonic uses. But these are mitigation measures layered onto continued legal use, not a ban. As of now, all three of the neonics the European Union prohibited outdoors remain fully registered for outdoor agricultural use across the United States, and neonic-treated seed remains the default option across huge swaths of United States corn and soybean farming, exactly as it was before the European Union's ban took effect. A handful of individual states in the United States have gone further than the federal government on their own. Several states have restricted or banned certain retail and homeowner uses of neonics, specifically the kind of garden center products that were putting these chemicals directly into suburban gardens and lawns, which represented a smaller but more visible and politically easier target than large-scale agricultural use. Large-scale farm application, though, remains a federal Environmental Protection Agency matter, and federal registration for agricultural use has not changed in the direction the European Union's ban went. It's worth noting, in fairness to the American system, that some agricultural economists and entomologists have specifically pushed back on framing this purely as regulatory laxity. Their argument is that an abrupt ban risks pushing farmers toward older pesticide classes that are sprayed rather than applied as seed treatment, some of which carry their own, sometimes worse, documented risks to a broader range of insects and to farm worker exposure, since spraying affects a wider area than a targeted seed coating. The European Union's own post-ban agricultural data has become part of this debate, with mixed reporting on crop yield impacts and a documented partial return to older spray-based alternatives in select cases, complicating the picture of the ban as an unambiguous net environmental win. This is a genuinely more contested trade-off than most of what we've covered on this channel so far, and it's worth sitting with that complexity rather than flattening it into a simple villain story. There are two more pieces of this story worth understanding before we get to what you can actually do about it, because both complicate the simple version of this narrative in useful ways. The first is that most of the coverage of this topic, including the earlier part of this video, focuses on honeybees because they are the most economically visible pollinator and the ones beekeepers can directly monitor for colony level collapse. But a significant share of the research the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, relied on in its 2018 assessment specifically examined wild bee species, bumblebees and solitary bees, not just managed honeybee colonies. Wild pollinators do not have a beekeeper checking on them, which means population decline is harder to measure and gets far less media attention. But several of the field studies the EFSA reviewed, including a large multi-country study conducted across the United Kingdom, Germany, and Hungary in 2017, found that wild bee species showed measurable negative effects from neonic exposure in some study sites, even more pronounced than the effects observed in managed honeybee colonies at the same sites. This matters because wild, unmanaged pollinators handle a substantial share of pollination for both crops and wild plant ecosystems, and they are the harder half of this story to actually track and protect. The second complication is a genuine fairness point that critics of the European Union's own record have raised. For years, several European Union member states permitted the manufacture of neonicotinoids for export to countries outside the European Union, even after banning their use inside European Union borders, meaning a chemical judged too risky for European farmland could still be legally produced in a European factory and shipped to a country with weaker restrictions, the United States included in some cases depending on the specific product and manufacturer. This became enough of a documented controversy that the European Union passed new rules in 2020 specifically aimed at closing that export loophole for domestically banned pesticides, with a phase-in period extending into recent years. It is a detail worth knowing because it is a useful reminder that the phrase banned in the European Union describes what is allowed on European Union farmland and European Union store shelves. It does not automatically mean the European Union has fully stopped participating in the global production and trade of the same substance, which is a more complicated, less flattering picture than the simple ban headline suggests. One more detail on exposure worth knowing: neonic-coated seed isn't just a nectar and pollen issue. During planting, mechanical seeders can release fine dust from the coated seed into the surrounding air, and that dust drift has been separately documented as a pathway for pollinator exposure, even in fields adjacent to the treated crop itself. Not just within it, one of the specific findings that pushed EFSA's 2018 assessment toward covering essentially all outdoor uses rather than just the flowering crop uses the original 2013 partial restriction targeted. So, practically, here's what you can actually do with this information, because unlike a food label, you can't check a cornfield for neonic use before buying groceries. It's also worth understanding what the EU's ban actually changed on the ground, rather than just what it prohibited on paper, because the aftermath has been more mixed than either side of this debate tends to admit. Follow-up agricultural data collected across several EU member states in the years after the 2018 ban showed that a meaningful share of farmers shifted toward pyrethroid insecticides as a replacement, an older class of chemical that is sprayed onto crops rather than applied as a seed coating. Pyrethroids carry their own differently distributed set of environmental risks. They are generally considered more acutely toxic to a broader range of insects on direct contact, including some beneficial predator insects that help control other pests naturally, though they don't share neonics' systemic nectar and pollen exposure pathway in the same way. Some entomologists have specifically pointed to this substitution effect as evidence that a single chemical ban, without a broader integrated pest management strategy to go with it, can end up trading one set of ecological trade-offs for a different one, rather than eliminating pesticide risk to pollinators altogether. This doesn't undercut the core finding about neonics and bee health, which remains well supported across the research base, but it's a genuinely important asterisk on treating the 2018 ban as a clean, unambiguous fix, rather than the start of an ongoing, still unresolved policy challenge. The most direct lever available to an individual consumer is organic certification. USDA organic standards prohibit synthetic pesticides, including neonicotinoids, as part of certification. So if avoiding neonic exposure specifically matters to you, that's the most reliable label-level signal currently available in a US grocery store, even though organic as a category covers a much broader set of restrictions than just this one chemical class. For home gardening specifically, check any retail pesticide or systemic plant treatment product for the active ingredients imidacloprid, clothianidin, or thiamethoxam listed by name. These show up in a range of consumer lawn and garden products, not just farm-scale agriculture, and several states now require point-of-sale disclosure or have restricted these specific consumer uses, which is worth checking against your own state's current rules. And if you want to support pollinators directly, planting a genuinely pesticide-free, diverse, native flower bed does more for local bee populations than any single grocery store purchasing decision. According to most of the entomology research on this topic, habitat loss and nutritional stress from monoculture landscapes are consistently cited alongside pesticide exposure as major contributing factors to pollinator decline. And it's one of the few pieces of this entire story where an individual has direct, unambiguous control over the outcome. This channel compares food and agricultural standards across the US, UK, and EU using publicly available regulatory information, including EFSA risk assessments, EPA registration review documentation, and peer-reviewed pollinator research. Content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Regulations and registration status change over time, so always check current sources for yourself. We are not affiliated with or endorsed by any brand, company, or organization mentioned. Next time, we're going back to the food aisle for one of the strangest recent stories in this entire series, of food coloring the EU banned over cancer concerns in 2022, that a US lawsuit against a major candy brand tried to get banned here too, using almost the exact same evidence. Subscribe to see how that case turned out.